Hello, this is the 256th edition of Catch of the Day, available on the Branch Talk YouTube channel. Today we're going to continue reading from a book written by Trent Wilde entitled The Mosaic Torah. Starting midway on page 15, we read, "Will I not go and strike him down and remove today the disgrace from Israel? Because who is this uncircumcised one who scorns the camp of the living God? The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and from the claws of the bear, he will rescue me from the hand of this uncircumcised Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." And Saul put on David a wool cloak and bronze helmet on his head, and he strapped his sword unto David around his wool cloak. But he grew weary walking around a few times. So David said to Saul, "I would not be able to go on in this because I have no experience." So they removed them from him. And he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 perfect stones for himself from the wadi, and put them in the shepherd bag that was with him for storage. And with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine man. Then the Philistine came on, getting nearer and nearer to David, with his shield-bearer in front of him. And Goliath saw David, and had contempt for him, because he was a boy, and he was ruddy and attractive, with attractive eyes. Footnote number 14, or meanwhile, as in the NIV. So the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you would come against me with a stick and stones? But David answered, No, rather you are worse than a dog. And the Philistine swore at David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come over here to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky, and to the beasts of the ground. And David replied to the Philistine, You come against me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to you with the name of the Lord God of hosts, of the army of Israel, whom you scorned today. And the Lord will shut you up today into my hand, and I will kill you, and remove your head from you, and give your limbs and the limbs of the army of the Philistines on this day to the birds of the sky, and the wild animals of the ground. And the entire world will know that God is in Israel. And this entire assembly will know that not by the sword or spear doth the Lord deliver, because the battle is the Lord's, and the Lord will hand over you into my hand. And the Philistines rose and went to meet David. David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David reached his hand into his bag, and took a single stone from there and launched it. He struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone penetrated through his helmet into his forehead, and he fell on his face on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with the sling and with the stone, and he struck down the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. And David ran and stood over him, and took his sword, and executed him, and removed his head. And the Philistines saw that their strongest had died, and they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose and raised the war cry. And they pursued them closely, as far as the entrance to Gath, and as far as the gate to Escalon. And corpses of the Philistines fell on the road to the gate, even as far as Gath, and as far as Ekron. And the men of Israel returned, turning around after the Philistines, and trampled their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine, and brought it to Jerusalem, and his weapons he put in his tent. Now when Saul saw David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Whose son is this young man, Abner?" Footnote 15. This sentence is dropped out of the MT. Footnote 16, literally, and. And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. Then the king said, You inquire whose son this young man is. So when David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul. The head of the Philistine was in his hand. Then Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David said, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. When he finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan became attached to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him on that very day and did not allow him to return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped off the robe that he was wearing, and gave it to David, along with his fighting attire, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. David went out whenever Saul sent him, and he succeeded. So Saul appointed him over the men of the war. And it pleased all the people, and even pleased the servant of Saul. When they were coming back after David had returned from striking down the Philistine, and the dancers came out to meet David from every town in Israel, with tambourines and with celebration, and with cymbals, and the women began and sang, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And the statement was viewed as evil in Saul's eyes. And this is what he said about these words, To David they give the 10,000s, and to me they give thousands. And Saul began watching David with suspicion from that day onward. On the next day, the evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he prophesied in the middle of the house. Footnote number 17. This appears to be the first meeting of Saul and David in DG2, whereas they were already well acquainted in DG1. 18. This verse is perhaps better translated, and this, the event of verse 1 to 5, happened at their coming back when David returned from striking down the Philistine. 19. Women in the MT. 20. Saul in the MT. 21. The words, the lyre, and not in the Hebrew text. Now David was playing the lyre with his hand on that day as usual, and the spear was in Saul's hand. Then Saul hurled the spear and thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice, and Saul was afraid from the presence of David, because Yahweh was with him, but had departed from Saul. Take care.